Well, hello there, and congrats on buying a new Satran. Today I'm going to show you how to assemble one piece by piece because there are a lot of parts. Well, let's get started. After you have received your kit and checked that you have all the parts, we start with the top plate and the first motor. Make sure that the wire from the motor is in a 90-degree angle from the center of the top plates. Now flip it over and fasten the motor with 2 screws. Now put a dab of grease in each of the 8 slots in the top plate. Now put a single bearing ball in each of the 8 slots. For this, it's good to use a pair of pliers. Now add the turntable to the assembly and repeat the process with 8 more metal pellets. Now it's time for the bottom plate. This has a groove that should be facing downwards toward the metal pellets. But before we can do this, we add the small cog wheel. So put it on the motor axle and push it all the way down. Make sure that the hole in the bottom plate is lined up with the motor axle. Put it in and fasten it with 5 more screws. Fasten the screws firmly, but not too hard. You have to be able to turn the turntable easily without too much resistance. If it's too tight, loosen it a quarter of turn and try again. And when you're finished, it's good to rotate the turntable back and forth a bit to make sure that the grease gets evenly distributed inside the turntable. And now we flip it over and it's time to add the base mount. Next we pick out one of the limit switches, the one with the shorter cable. If it's mounted correctly, when you push down the base mount to the top plate, you should hear a small click. And now we can go ahead and fasten the base mount to the top plate. And these screws are small, so it's good to have a pair of pliers and small agile fingers. The next step is to fasten the last motor to the motor mount and also add the second limit switch. Now the entire part should fit perfectly in the base mount. Make sure that all the cables are going under the motor mount, towards the front. Now we can add the small worm gear. I've already prepared this one. I've sanded it down with a fine grit paper to make it as smooth as possible, and also I've added grease on top. Put the gear on the motor axle and push it in as far as it can go. We now go ahead and prepare the main axle using the threaded rod and different hex nuts. However, I have already sheeted and prepared this in advance, so this is how it looks. We have the main axle, a standard hex nut inside the large worm gear. On the other side, this is a flange nut holding it firmly in place, and the entire worm gear should be in the middle of the axle. Also, there's a lock nut on each side, and this will help to hold the entire axle in place inside the rotator. Go ahead and fasten the two bearings to the large sides using M3 nuts and bolts. The bearings should be on the side with a smooth surface. We now add one of the sides, the one closest to the limit switch. Also, don't forget to put a screw that fastens the side to the motor mount. And just as we did with the small worm gear, we can also use fine grit paper to sand down the large worm gear. This will give it a lot smoother and stronger operation. it's all coming along quite nicely, and now we can add the last side and fasten it with screws. Make sure that the limit switch doesn't get stuck up on the large worm gear. You can adjust this with the two lock nuts. You don't want the entire axle to be able to move too much, so use the two lock nuts to adjust the position. One of the last steps is adding the controller board. First we fasten it to the circuit holder. On the back of the circuit holder there's a small hole, and this will fit on top of the small worm gear. So if you want to, you can put a dab of grease in there. Find the slots for the circuit holder, push it down and inwards, and make sure that it fits on top of the small worm gear. Job well done, my young apprentice. The next job is to connect the cables to the control board. The limit switch with the short cable is the azimuth. On the control board you can read text for elevation and azimuth, so it's pretty straightforward. The cables from the two stepper motors are similar but color-coded, so make sure that the red wire on the connector is facing left towards the red stepper drivers and the black wire on the right towards the microcontroller. Each control board is supplied with two heat sinks for the red stepper drivers, but under normal conditions these actually aren't necessary, so we can leave them for now. Take out the power cable and bring the white connector through the center of the assembly. All the newer control boards have a white connector that can only go one way, but if you have an older board it's important to note which is ground and which is the positive. On top of the circuit holder you might have noticed this hole. This can be used with a plastic strip to fasten the power cable, so it doesn't get tangled up, or if you pull it, you won't hurt the control board. Now you can add two regular hex nuts to the main axle and then flange nuts, but don't fasten them yet because we will add the antenna mount. Before we can add the antenna, we need to put the worm gear in the correct position, so use your fingers to turn the small worm gear until you hear a click from the limit switch. If you haven't already, you can fasten the antenna to the antenna mount. For the next step, it's good to have a friend to assist you. Add the antenna mount to the main axle. The antenna or the antenna mount should now be in a 90-degree angle facing upwards. This is very important, and be careful when you fasten the screws not to nudge the worm gear in the middle, because this will make the settings incorrect. Now use your tools to fasten the antenna mount really hard, but always be careful not to nudge the worm gear. Excellent work! We're almost finished. But before we can power up, we need to bring the antenna down by about 20 degrees using your fingers on the small worm gear. If you would boot up the rotator with the antenna in a vertical position, you might give excessive force on the gears and even nudge the settings, giving incorrect readings. Now we're gonna connect the Satran to a stable 9-volt power supply. Bring out your smartphone, open Settings and Connections. Open Wi-Fi and search for the Wi-Fi called Satran Setup and Connect. Next, we open our browser and we type the IP address directly to the Satran, which is 192.168.4.1. Select your desired network and apply your password. And when you're finished, press save and make sure that you have connected back to your own network. As you can see, the rotator is now initializing and searching for its end positions, both azimuth and elevation. If you haven't already, it's now time to install the Satran Control, which is a free app available from Google Play. For the Satran to work, you need to apply the settings, most importantly the IP address directly to the Satran. And for this you might need to log into your router and check your settings. I have already assigned a static IP address to mine, which ensures that it always stays the same even when I reboot the Satran. However, upcoming versions of the app will hopefully be able to find the IP address automatically. In case it didn't work or you need to change Wi-Fi, it's possible to reset the Satran. Directly on the controller board of the Satran, there is a small reset button. Push and hold this button for about 3 seconds until the light goes on, and then you can redo the entire process again if you need to. That's all there is to it. If you have any questions, visit the forum or email me anytime. I wish you all the best, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel for more crazy inventions.